Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking time to join us for this webinar. My name is Janet Huyshutter, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Dystonia Medical Research Foundation, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for this program. The DMRF is pleased to present educational webinars on topics we believe the community will find helpful. If you have ideas on topics or suggestions for programming, please send us an email at dystonia@dystonia-foundation.org. We'd love to hear from you and receive your ideas. Thank you for sending those. I want to first thank all of our members and donors for their support of the important work of the DMRF. We're only able to do these kinds of programs because of your generosity, and we're grateful. The DMRF is dedicated to doing what we can to expand the menu of treatment options available to physicians and to the patients that they serve. As a part of that commitment to the community, we try to help the companies that are sponsoring these studies in any way that we can. Currently, there are a couple of companies that are testing compounds for the treatment of dystonia, and we're working with them to help recruit eligible participants. We thought this would be a good time to do a program on the clinical trial process, and thus the topic for this webinar is what you need to know about clinical trials. We see this as the first in a series of educational resources that we are dedicated to providing the community to learn about the clinical trial process. We have a fantastic faculty for this program, and we're looking forward to the information that they'll share with us. But first, just a couple of announcements. As you know, this is a Zoom webinar, so everyone but our speakers will be muted. We want your questions. Your questions are an important part of this program. Please put them into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We have disabled the chat function just to help us manage your questions. We'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have allotted. Those we don't get to will help us decide the topics for our next educational programming. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the DMRF YouTube channel. Everyone who registered for the program will receive an email with the link if you want to share it or if you'd like to watch the program again. So, on to our program. We have wonderful speakers, as I said, Dr. Richard Barbano and Carole Rawson. Dr. Barbano is Professor of Neurology at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. He has developed a special interest in the evaluation, treatment, and long-term care of patients with dystonia. This has evolved into an interest in other movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease and tremor. He's been the director of the botulinum toxin clinic since 1995, actively participates in research projects aimed at improving and understanding the treatment of movement disorders like dystonia. Dr. Barbano received his medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine and his PhD from Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Barbano did his internship in internal medicine at UPMC Montefiore University Hospital and a neurology residency at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Dr. Barbano served as a mentor for one of the DMRF's clinical fellows, was a speaker at last year's virtual Zoo Day, and has been a wonderful resource for the DMRF over the years. He will provide us with a general overview on the clinical trial process. His presentation will be followed by Carole Rawson's personal insights in what it's been like to participate in clinical trials. Carole Rawson is a member of the DMRF Board of Directors, a longtime advocate for the dystonia community, Vice President of Public Policy for the Dystonia Medical Research Foundation, and currently serves as the chair for the Dystonia Advocacy Network, which is a collaborative effort of 4 dystonia patient organizations. She has also participated in NIH clinical trials, which she'll share her insights with us. At this point, it's really my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Barbano.
Thank you very much, Janet, for that kind introduction. And thanks for everybody who is participating here today, Carole, Veronica, and really the audience. So what I'd like to do is, as Janet said, I'm going to try and give an overview of what you need to know about clinical trials. And obviously, this is an important topic, and I also feel that it's something that is near and dear to my heart. Next slide, please. When we when we talk about clinical trials, they're part of the big overview of what we would call research. And there's many types of research. And these include databases, observational studies, clinical trials. And clinical trials is what we're going to concentrate on today. And I'll explain a little bit about the difference about those. But what they all have in common is the desire to expand our knowledge about a disorder, in this case, dystonia, the people living with it, and how to improve the lives of people that have this disorder. Next slide, please. The big question then comes up is why do research? And that's a valid question. And I'd like to give a fairly succinct answer, and that is that the evidence that we gain through research really is important. It's critical to guide the best care for patients and their families or caregivers. Research can often involve other people besides the patient with the disorder. What you see I have in the bottom is that research equals hope. I would like to take credit for that, but I saw that on some folder and I wish I could remember which one it was to give, proper accreditation. But it really stuck with me because to be involved in research and to do research is really very future oriented. It's a hope for the future. And that's why that saying really sticks with me. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do is talk a bit about the phases of research. And as Janet said, this is going to be an overview. It'll be very hard for me to cover everything, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, but those are great because then we can fill in gaps with further, maybe later into question and answers or maybe further webinars. But the first thing to remember are preclinical phases, and this research occurs with animal models, cell models, and these are very important to form the basis of any sort of intervention that a person wants to do to try to help patients with a particular disorder. I'll just say dystonia again. But what I'm saying here really goes for any type of disorder, but really we're concentrating on dystonia. Now, preclinical phases, obviously, as I said, are animal models and cell models. And then there's the clinical phases. Clinical phases always involve people. And, when you get to that clinical phase, the preclinical phases should be already done. They should be completed. There should be some good ideas of how a potential medication might work in people. Then you wind up going into the clinical phases of research. Again, there are three. Phase one, and you'll hear these terms, phase one is usually with healthy volunteers. And the purpose of each phase is to answer very specific questions. The purpose of phase one, again, in healthy volunteers, is to say, is this new drug safe? What are the safe dose ranges? How does the body handle it? How does it get excreted or absorbed, or however the body takes care or metabolizes a particular drug? And does it get to the right place in the body? If you were designing a medication to treat joint disease, you would certainly want to make sure that that gets into the joints of people. Because remember, the phase one trials don't begin until there's at least some good safety data from the preclinical animal phases. And so then the next phases are animals are not always the same as people. So let's make sure that these are okay for people. That's phase one. Next slide, please. Then you move on to phase two. Then phase two starts to involve people with the disorder. This involves more subjects than it did than phase 1 trials, and in fact, phase 3 will even be more. But phase 2 trials are designed to answer the questions again, is this drug safe in people who have dystonia? What are the doses ranges that are tolerated in people who have dystonia? And then to start to get a little bit of an inkling, is there any evidence that this drug might be useful or helpful? If medications make it through, or potential medications or drugs make it through phase 2, then they go on to phase 3. Phase 3, you'll hear that term a lot, phase 3 clinical trial, because phase 3 clinical trials are critical. And phase 3 clinical trials are what are largely used by the FDA to get approval for a medication to then be used for patients. Now, phase 3 studies answer two very specific questions. Is the drug safe and effective? And does it improve people's lives? So all of those components are important. Is it safe? Is it effective? Does it do what you think it is? And more importantly, is it really improving people's lives? So those are the three phases of research. And again, you'll hear a lot about phase 3 trials in the news, because these are really ultimately the final phase before trying to get FDA approval to bring a potential drug to patients. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do now, because you will hear a lot of terms thrown around, especially if you follow the news or if you are thinking about participating in research. So I want to review some of the really clinical trial basic terms. The first one that comes up is you hear the term trial, you hear the term study. And to be honest, they're often used interchangeably, although technically trials involve an intervention, whereas studies are usually observational, such as a natural history study, or a biomarker study, or an epidemiologic study. But often, in practical terms, these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Now, when we talk about clinical trials, we talked about that phase 3, really that ultimately, how are we going to show that a medication works? Usually, by and large, it's by comparing it to a placebo. And what is a placebo? You've probably heard that term before. A placebo is a harmless substance that should have no therapeutic effect. And it's used as a control in testing the potential benefits of a drug. Now, control, I use the word control, and what control in this sense means is a comparator, right? So if you had a medication and a placebo and you gave it to two people and they both got better, it's really hard to say that the drug helped. You really need to have a comparator. That's what a placebo does. It allows you to compare where everything else is theoretically held as uniform as possible. Now, the washout is a period of time that participants need to do to let go of an ongoing commitment before they become eligible for a trial. Now, that may be because the new medication may be potentially an advancement of an existing medication. Well, you want that existing medication washed out. So when you do the trial, you know that this is the benefit that we're looking for with this new medication. And then you'll hear the term endpoint. An endpoint is not doesn't mean the end of the trial. Endpoints are the goals of the trial. There'll be primary endpoints and secondary endpoints. These have to be chosen ahead of time. And that's really to avoid the concept of sort of a fishing expedition. In clinical trials, there is no, oh, we'll give this to people and see what happens. That doesn't work that way. You have to have primary endpoints. What are we looking to improve exactly? And then secondary endpoints. What are the other potential benefits of this medication? Next slide, please. So more terms that you might hear. Adverse effects, which are unexpected medical issues that happen during a trial. They may or may not be related to the clinical trial or the medication, and they may be obviously mild, moderate, or even severe. But the importance that in a trial, a subject should report everything that happens, and then we let the data decide, is that related to the drug that we're treating or not? For example, if you do a clinical trial and someone happens to get the flu, you might say they happen to get the flu, it had nothing to do with the medication. But there's always the potential that that medication made someone more likely to get the flu for one reason or another. So all adverse effects should be reported. The next term you might come up to is tolerability, and that is how tolerable are the potential side effects of a medication? So everybody takes medications, as even over-the-counter medications sometimes have some side effects. But if the benefit greatly outweighs the side effects, we would call that tolerable. And then obviously the final term here is efficacy. Does the drug or treatment produce the desired effect? Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is now, since we have some basics on the terms, is think about some trial designs. And what I mean by a trial design is how are we going to go about and try to see whether a medication or a new drug is useful? There's open label trials. Open label trials are where everybody knows what a person or a subject is being given. The subject knows, the investigator or their doctor knows, all their healthcare providers knows. It's open. Now, the advantage of open label trials is that you can you don't have to guess, you don't have to worry about control groups, but everybody knows what a person's medication they're getting. Now, it's not felt that open label trials give as critical of information as what we're going to call a placebo-controlled trial. So placebo-controlled trials are where you try to keep two groups of people exactly the same, give one the medication and give the other the placebo. Everything else tries to stay the same so that any difference in outcome measures, or safety for that matter, can be attributed to the active treatment. Next slide, please. So the another particular trial design is called a crossover. And that is where people initially start either in the experimental group with the new medication or the placebo group. They each get a chance on that medication, measurements are taken, and then they flip-flop. This is a way that often is able to get information with studies that can have potentially fewer patients because all subjects in the study are going to get both the investigational treatment and the placebo. Randomized trials are ones where people are placed in a trial randomly. That is, you don't pick who gets what placebo and who receives the active drug. And this is actually done away from the site that is doing the study to help reduce any bias in the trial. We all know that if you get attention and you start to get care, people feel better. And so what's important to know is when you have a placebo, neither the patient nor the investigator know whether a person had placebo or active medication, and it's done in a random way to really reduce the odds of any unusual misdistribution among the groups. Again, I mentioned this, but I didn't actually use the term, which is double blind. And double blind, again, is where everybody, including the sponsor of the trial, is unaware of who's receiving placebo and who's receiving the drug being tested. That information is kept in a sealed database. Next slide, please. So these, as you've been hearing me say, these are often combined to reduce bias. And there, it leads to what we consider sort of the gold standard of clinical trial design, and that is double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trial. Combining all those important aspects is really felt to produce the highest level of confidence possible in the results. And that confidence level is very important to the FDA to give approval and to the providers who are going out and treating patients. Next slide, please. Now, drug development can take years. Actually, the average is about 12 to 15 years. And so it's very important when one is considering participating in clinical trials that one really has to think about the future. Again, this is why I say research is hope, and this is hope for the future. Because on average, it takes 12 to 15 years between identifying a potential medication and the time it actually gets approved for patient use. Now, all of these potential compounds go through that preclinical animal study. Then, if those animal studies show that they're safe and potentially effective, and that's done by a review agency, then it goes into that clinical trial pathway, that pipeline, goes through phases 1, 2, and 3, and then requires final approval in the USA. That's by the FDA, who will review all phases, especially phases 2 and 3, prior to approval. Next slide, please. So participating in clinical trials is a wonderful thing. It's got to be voluntary. No one should ever feel that their participation is contingent on anything. And the role of the person participating, the subject, is to understand the purpose. And this obviously should be explained by the investigator, by the clinical trial team, and understand the responsibilities of the people who want to participate, the subject. What is the time commitment? Can I follow the study protocol? Will I be able to make all visits? All of these should be discussed well ahead of time with your clinical trial team. Then once people get the experimental medications, it's critical to take the medications as instructed. And if something is unclear, always ask. This is a team effort. The team really includes not just the clinical trial team, but the subjects. There's no research without subjects. So it is a team effort. Next slide, please. The other things that are important in knowing is understand how safety is monitored. When you enter a clinical trial, understand that the FDA reviews the preclinical data, receives ongoing notifications and updates from the sponsor about safety. Another layer of safety is what's called the IRB, or the Institutional Review Board. And this is often an ethics committee that will oversee the informed consent, ensure the principles of beneficence and justice. Research involves beneficence, and that is it really felt that the benefit outweighs the risk? And justice, are the potential benefits shared equally among all people? Another layer of safety is called the DSMB, or the Data Safety Monitoring Board. As you can see, people like acronyms. But this includes clinical experts, monitors who review all the study sites as the trial is going on and recommends action if they start to see safety signals or any issues are identified. And then finally, even though the site study team are often blinded, it's the site study team who has the obligation to evaluate all adverse events including adverse laboratories. Next slide, please. Informed consent, it's not just signing a paper. It's the process by which a subject voluntarily confirms willingness to participate in a particular trial. That informed consent has to provide adequate information about the study that's understandable to the subject, provide specific information about the study in a way that is understandable and gives them adequate time to consider participation. Besides being voluntary, nobody should feel rushed to participate in a clinical trial in most cases. Obviously, in emergency type research, it's a different story. And then informed consent is there to provide updates during a trial to allow subjects to decide whether they want to continue to participate in a trial. Next slide, please. Informed consent also serves the purpose of avoiding being influenced by unknown expectations. Remember, if people knew that this new trial medication worked, you wouldn't need to do clinical trials. These are still unknowns. Informed consent, again, should explain the purpose of the research, the expected duration, the procedures someone should go through, as well as the probability of randomization. What are the odds that a particular subject is going to be on a placebo versus the potentially active ingredient? Should describe any reasonably foreseeable risks and outline how those records are going to maintain confidentiality. What I put there, www.clinicaltrials.gov, is a registry of clinical trials that are going on around the country. This assures that this is not that this is a bona fide clinical trial that the subject is participating in. Next slide. So in summary, there's many kinds of research. They're all important in understanding diseases, their courses and consequences, how they affect patients and their families. We feel that clinical trials are the best way of gaining insight into how best to improve the lives of patients and their families. Participation is always voluntary, can be time-consuming, but it's also critical in moving forward to a better future. And next slide, I think that is it. I want to thank everybody for your attention, and we look forward to the questions. I'm going to put myself on mute at this time.
Hi, as Janet said earlier, I'm Carole Rawson, the Vice President of Public Policy for the Dystonia Medical Research Foundation. In 1967, at the age of 10, I was no longer able to write with either hand. At that time, my parents realized that I had what my father had. 5 years later, in 1972, 53 years ago, my father and I were diagnosed with dystonia. It affected our hands, which twist and spasm when we attempted to write or do any other fine motor movement. Later, my sister, my nephew, and our daughter received the same diagnosis. Unlike the others, with every passing year, my daughter's dystonia began to affect other regions of her body. At the age of 19, she was no longer able to walk or feed herself. At that time, she came home and underwent deep brain stimulation surgery. Fortunately, it was very successful. She was able to return to college and graduate, and now lives a relatively normal life. At the time of Liz's diagnosis, I realized I needed to do more. I became a clinical trial participant. I went to the NIH, and I volunteered for any study that would have me. I feel it's incumbent upon those of us with dystonia, with the disorder, to do what we can to further researchers, to help investigators, develop new treatments, and ultimately one day a cure. At that time, I also became an advocate for dystonia funding. And to this day, I attend Dystonia Hill Day every year and participate in everything that I can to help get more research funding and, again, hope to find a cure for the dystonia community, excuse me. And with that, I will turn this back to Janet, who will take over and go through questions and answers.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Dr. Barbano. That was great. Exactly what we needed was a nice overview. So a couple of questions to start with. And I think one is how is the eligibility for a study determined? We had a number of people post questions about their particular situation and their willingness to participate, but there may not be a trial or a study for that particular form of dystonia. How do these come about?
Do you want me to take that, or do you
Yeah,
take it,
please,
Carol?
sorry.
Yeah. Well, eligibility is designed in order to show a particular treatment is effective for a particular symptom or particular disorder. As you know, we heard Carol, she has her family members have had generalized dystonia. There are people who only have dystonia, say, of the eyes or of the neck. And so if a particular treatment is only meant to help the portion of the body that's affected by dystonia, that goes into eligibility criteria. So if a medication is felt maybe to, and this doesn't really apply to dystonia. So in dystonia, it's often what type of dystonia does a person have? Do they have a particular gene abnormality? Is it affecting a particular part of their body? We will often see trials that are designed only, let's say, for cervical dystonia that is affecting the neck, or generalized dystonia affecting any part of the body. So eligibility really depends on what the aim of the potential treatment is meant to help. There can be eligibility based on age restrictions. There can be eligibility based on a number of different criteria. But the purpose of eligibility, again, in the broadest sense, is just to make sure that you're dealing with a particular group of subjects that display the problem that you're trying to solve.
Right, thank you. And it's fair to say that if you're not eligible for one study, you're willing to participate, you should continue to look at clinicaltrials.gov to see when there might be a trial or a study that you could be eligible for, right?
Correct. Often there may be more than one trial going on, even in a particular place, like for example, our university. But there's also those studies, natural history studies,
Right.
national database collections. I can tell you that we participate in a dystonia study group that through what we would call natural history and biomarkers, or people with dystonia volunteering to give a sample of blood, have been able to identify a number of new potential participant genes. So not all, as I said, not all research involves an investigational new treatment, and yet can be really critically valuable towards moving the field forward.
Right. No, that's important. Thank you for emphasizing that.
And
Carol,
if I may, when I've been a trial participant at NIH has reached out to me when they feel that I could be an eligible candidate for other trials. So once you get in the network, I think, they will reuse you if they know you're a willing and able volunteer.
right. That's good to know. And how did you find out about your first study that you participated in, and what was it?
I've done many. I don't recall what the first one was, but I believe I did go to clinical trials and found it. And then I know I was referred at NIH for multiple studies. It was interesting because this year at our annual board meeting, we had a new investigator and they presented a study that they did. And I was sitting there with my mouth agape because I said, I was in that study.
Well, that actually goes to one of our questions that we received in advance of tonight, which is, should I expect to hear how I did in the study?
No.
And maybe. Well,
I mean, I can only speak for myself, but.
So you didn't hear specifically how you did. Did you hear the study?
I know I did. I know I've done. No, I never heard how I've done, and I know I did a genetic study through I think Mount Sinai in New York, and they wouldn't give me any information. So I don't know if that. I mean, this was some years ago, so I don't know if protocol has changed, but at least for that one.
Yeah, and Dr. Barbano, should people expect to hear, maybe not specifically how they individually did in that study, but should they expect to hear how the study did overall?
Well, I'm smiling because we just had our annual International Movement Disorder Society meeting. And every year there is a session dedicated to controversies. And the controversy this year, there were two, every year we do two, was should study participants get the results of their participation? And there was a pro and con. So right now, as Carole says, the standard is not to reveal individual study um, study data. In other words, every person doesn't get how they did. Usually, the people who participate in the trial can get a sort of an overview of a sum of how the trial went. But right now, people don't generally get those results. And you asked the question and you phrased it, Janet, should people get those results? This is what the controversy was because not all results are benign emotionally, right? If you're doing a genetic study, it not only involves you, but it involves your family members. So not all individual study data is returned to patients. And mostly that's because when you participate in a trial, the data really is meant to be aimed at a specific question. Remember, I had said that when you do a clinical trial should have predetermined endpoints. It should not be, as I said, a fishing expedition. Whereas going through reams and reams of genetic data can be a bit of not a fishing expedition, but an exploratory issue. And part of the controversy is that not all that data has not really the manifestation of that data has not necessarily been figured out yet. So I couldn't say to a person, hey, you have this odd gene and it may cause a problem, but we don't know that yet. So giving people half information can have emotional consequences.
And would it be fair to say that that you should learn whether or not you can expect to get results back or hear about it before you decide to participate? I mean, is that a fair question to ask?
I think that's a fair question to ask. And at least, I mean, certainly that should be discussed. It's as Carole mentioned, the only way we're going to move forward is by having people volunteer for studies. But it is voluntary, so people should ask any questions, whether they can be answered or not, but any questions that they feel they need to know to decide whether they want to participate.
Right.
And I believe truly, if you are willing to be a clinical trial participant, obviously it's nice to get the results, but it's really incumbent on the field to be the participant regardless of whether or not you find out the results.
Right. Thank you for that. We had a couple of questions. And Dr. Barbano, I'll give this to you. One is, can Canadians participate in U.S. clinical trials?
I'm going to punt on that one.
We could phone a friend.
I have to phone a friend. That has not come up that I've ever thought about. I don't even want to venture a guess. I think
Okay.
that's something we'll find out and have to get back to somebody on.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect answer. Yeah. Is it possible to participate remotely, Dr. Barbano, in a clinical trial?
Some trials can be done totally remotely now, as in, with the advancement of sensors, right? Sensors and computer-based evaluation tools. People can sometimes participate, remotely, but not always. And it's hard to draw bloods remotely. It's hard
Right.
to do lumbar punctures or other sort of test procedures that you might want to do remotely. So
Right.
some trials maybe, others maybe not.
Yeah. And Carole, you mentioned that you live in California, but you participated in trials at NIH. Did you have to stay in the area, or were you participating remotely?
I always went back to
Okay.
participate.
Yeah. So the trials that you did, you had to be there.
I did have to be there for it.
Yeah. Okay.
I did a transcranial stimulation, and obviously I needed to be there for that.
Right. Yeah.
There were
That
many
makes
with
sense.
MRIs, so
Right. And the requirements for the participation would be spelled out, right, Dr. Barbano, before the participant is deemed eligible, right? So if they have to be there, if they have to come back 4 or 5 times, that's all spelled out for people in advance.
Correct. That should be part of the informed consent. But,
Okay.
speaking of just remotely, with the, given that everyone understands the burden of travel, there has been a push over the last 5, 10 years to have at least a number of the study visits done remotely, either through a Zoom, sometimes even just phone contact.
Mhm.
So there is certainly a conscious effort to reduce the burden of participating.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. We had a couple of questions about how to find out about whether or not they're trials in their area or for their condition. And again, www.clinicaltrials.gov is the site you want to go to, where all the clinical trials are listed. We had a question about if you're participating in a clinical trial and you have to go on placebo and go off all of your other medications, that you have the possibility of getting worse, that your dystonia would get worse. And is that a consideration for eligibility? Or, Dr. Barbano, you want to take that one?
Well, that's always a consideration. That generally is handled prior to a clinical trial being started. When we were talking about the safety, I mentioned that Institutional Review Board of Ethics. And so the Institutional Review Board of Ethics would be a group of oversight to potentially not to change a protocol to minimize the risk of somebody getting worse, not take them off potentially life-altering medications for something that that is not known whether it helps or not. That's the principle of beneficence. The beneficence is that, in the opinion of the expert and ethics committee, the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks.
We had a couple questions, some in advance and then some tonight, about whether your personal neurologist needs to check your eligibility, or is it the neurologist actually doing the clinical trial? And the question we got in advance is, what if my doctor is not doing trials? Am I still eligible to participate in trials? So Dr. Barbano, can you talk a little bit about that? You know, if your doctor is not a clinical trialist, but you want to participate, what's the communication there between the trial physician and the treating physician?
Yeah, so that's a great question. No, your personal neurologist does not have to be the person doing the actual clinical trial. It's not uncommon for me to do work with subjects in a clinical trial who are not my patients, who are patients of other doctors, even sometimes not even at my institution. Sometimes patients come from out of state to participate in clinical trials. So no, that's absolutely not necessary. And you don't have to ever feel like you have to give up your own personal doctor if you've got a good relationship with her or him. Um, that the participation in the clinical trial is independent of the clinical care. Now, there can be because of a protocol of a clinical trial that you may not be that your personal neurologist shouldn't start new treatments for, because that interferes with the ability to say just really to determine the effectiveness during the trial. That introduces a certain variability that we try to avoid. But otherwise, no, your personal neurologist does not have to be participating in that clinical trial.
And does the clinical trial site communicate the restrictions about new treatments to the patient's regular physician, or is that on the patient to communicate that?
In the ideal world, it should be both. It should be that the subject who's participating in the trial will be told you can't start new medications, you can't, do this during this trial. That's going to be part of the obligation of the subject. We don't know whether this new treatment is going to be the next great breakthrough or it's just going to be and so it's really important in these phase 3 trials to work with the clinical site investigator team and make sure what you should and should not do. Now, that should be also communicated to the patient's personal neurologist so that they understand. But it really should be incumbent on everybody that is involved here to understand what the trial is about and what are the do's and don'ts.
Right. And Carole, did you inform your treating physician that you were participating in trials at NIH?
No,
No?
I also wasn't on any medication, so it was
Okay.
less of a factor, I would assume, in my case, since I wasn't on meds.
Right. Okay. We've had a number of questions about, again, the Canadian governing body over clinical trials, and we'll get all of that information and make sure that we email that out to everybody. So everybody has that information. So we did, how long do clinical trials typically last? I know it's asking you to make a generalization, but what should people expect? Are they 6 months? Are they 3 months? Dr. Barbano, generally speaking, what's the length of a clinical trial?
Unfortunately, there is no general statement to make. It really depends on what it is that is the target of the treatment. Most of the time, most clinical trials, I guess I will make a general statement, are between, 2 months and a year. But there are trials that go on for 5 years. There are trials that are only 4 weeks. So it really depends on what the target symptom is. And the medication that's being treated. Carol talked about deep brain stimulation, which can be life altering. But it's not that the moment you get your deep brain stimulation, you wake up the next day and you're perfect. It takes months and months and months of adjustments and accommodations on the brain's part. So it's the same way in clinical trials. It's rare that you can try something, get all the results you need within a couple weeks.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's for DBS, it could be years before they have the right settings.
Uh, Absolutely.
So when you talk about hope, don't give up hope.
Right. Don't give up hope.
It took 2.5 years for our daughter to get her settings to where they were great.
Yeah.
yeah.
But even when they weren't great, they were better than she was. So she was still grateful for having had the surgery. So
Yeah, thank you for that. That's important to note. When does age knock out a possible candidate for a clinical trial? What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the rationale behind that is that as we age, as all of us age, our metabolism changes. Medications that you could tolerate when you were 40, you might not tolerate at 70. And so in a lot of times age knocks there's an age limit on eligibility for safety reasons,
Mhm.
such that here we have this experimental medication. We know it's safe in healthy volunteers, but we haven't had, 90-year-old healthy volunteers. We don't know if it's safe to move from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 in someone who may be, elderly. Or you may have an idea that a medication or a potential medication is not going to be metabolized well by an older liver, right?
Mhm.
So there's lots of medications that are approved that when patients start to get, 75, 80, 85, you start to dial back a little bit because they're not tolerating them or they're starting to cause side effects. So age relates to side effects. So age eligibility is often for safety reasons.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions about the cost of participating in trials. Generally, are travel costs covered? And then also, does insurance cover the cost of participation? So Carol, let me just first ask you, were you reimbursed for travel in the studies that you participated in?
yes, typically I would cover my airfare, even though I believe they were willing to.
Yeah,
I know that they were able to get me to, to NIH when I was in DC. I remember on a few occasions that they paid for a hotel for me when I was there. And then there is a daily reimbursement and it's nominal, but they do, give you something for having spent the day.
okay. And that was covered in when you were exploring whether or not to be a participant?
It was covered when I was offered, to be a candidate for
Right.
a study. So
Okay.
yes,
Yeah, that's good to know.
they do inform you of that.
Okay. And then Dr. Barbano are we looking for their people's insurance to cover these costs, or how are the costs covered?
Yeah, so insurance should never be involved in clinical trials. This is research, and the research should cover all the expenses related to the trial. Now, even some trials will budget in a bit of a travel budget or a lunch budget. As Carol says, there's often a nominal um, bit of money given to people who participate in the acknowledgement that they may be driving 50 miles or flying. Some trials will cover airfare. You may have a nominal participation budget to cover a reasonable lunch. You don't, so insurance companies should not pay. And it should not really cost the participant, any significant sums of money. On the other hand, um, it's not generally clinical trials are not paid. People don't get paid to participate because that's felt to be sort of an unfair inducement. That
Mhm.
goes against the principle of what we might call, you know, justice. If you're paying people to participate in a trial, then people who really need the money are going to participate, and you want a clinical trial to be open to everybody.
Right,
So
yeah.
some trials will cover nominal costs, such as travel and a meal or two, or even occasionally a hotel overnight.
Yeah, which it sounds like Carol, your hotels were covered occasionally so, yeah. And it would be good to ask, right? If you're
Yes.
interested and you're getting that far along in the eligibility process, you just want to ask so that you know.
Absolutely.
One final question, and it has to do, we received this in advance, and that has to do with dystonia being a collection of rare disorders. And, are there enough people to participate in the clinical trials that we're now starting to see? So Dr. Barbano, I would just, how does the FDA adjust for diseases and disorders that affect far more many people than does dystonia?
Well, the FDA doesn't really adjust for that, but it does go back to what Carol said. We research advancing really needs people to participate. And, just as in Carol's experience, many of my patients have participated in 2 or 3 of the clinical trials. And, it's a wonderful, giving thing to do. It's also, it's really critical if we're going to move forward. Um, so to answer that question, it can be hard sometimes to get a critical mass of people to do a clinical trial, which is why we really need people to participate, really need people to step up and do it. The number of people needed depends on the statistical analysis in order to be able to show that a medication or treatment works. And it's
Mhm.
different for different types of medications in different studies. But being a collection of rare disorders is a challenge in that sense, which is why, you know, um, foundations like the DMRF are so critical to moving forward. Everybody should join.
We
Yes,
agree.
yes.
But thank you for, I do want to just put a plug in for the DMRF's magazine, the Dystonia Dialogue, because that is where we do a lot of, um, explaining of what's happening in clinical trials, notices of recruitment, reminders about the clinicaltrials.gov website, those kinds of things. So if you're watching this program and you're not receiving the dialogue, you can go to our website and look at the digital edition, or you can sign up to receive the hard copy edition. And I would encourage you to do so. It's a way to stay in the loop on what's happening in all kinds of research, advocacy, and other programs as well. So that is all the time we have. I want to say thank you to both of you so much for your sharing, Carol sharing your experience, and Dr. Barbano sharing your experience in helping us better understand clinical trials. And we hope that everyone will consider participating in a clinical trial. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this, and thank the DMRF for their support over the years.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.